Hi, everyone. We're live. I'm Dark Journalist, and it's great to have you here. We have kind of a fantastic range of things to cover tonight, and one of the most important, of course, is the Nixon time capsule information that is coming out and rising to the surface. Now, I put out a video earlier today which featured Douglas Caddy giving us an update on, and really kind of more of a background to Robert Merritt. And just to recap it for people who don't know, Robert Merritt came forward on the program recently. On February 14th, we did an exclusive interview with him. And Merritt was an insider working with Nixon's Huston plan. And the Huston plan has been shrouded in secrecy since its inception, really. But it came about as something that Tom Huston put together. And Tom Huston was kind of ultra-conservative who came out of the Young Americans for Freedom and served with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Very interesting guy. But during this period when Nixon was having all these problems with protesters and these anti-war groups, Huston took it upon himself to create this kind of ultra-secret plan to kind of get a handle on the situation, because what Nixon wanted and what he eventually developed, if you think about it, was an internal intelligence unit that ran right out of the White House. So we're going to break into all these details around what was going on there and how that leads into the UFO disclosure narrative that is coming up now, because they tried this in the early 70s, and it was through Nixon, who had a great handle on the UFO file. So we're going to get into all that. Right off the bat, I want to say in the past couple of days, everyone's noticed that there's a tremendous kind of attrition rate for YouTube channels going on. And this is quite fascinating because, of course, it's always been out there that when you're reporting on these kind of deep state activities, you're going to be more of a target when YouTube decides, hey, we're going to clean house. And we saw some of that during the whole fake news thing where they came out with Prop or Not during the election. And they were saying, hey, you know, Trump didn't really win. It was just a Russian plot and all that nonsense. As it turns out, what they tried to do at that point was get rid of the alternative media by linking everyone to the Kremlin. And that campaign, although they put a lot into it, it collapsed, much like we see a lot of these ops collapsing because they don't have that kind of hardcore substance. But they kept on with it for a long time, and they certainly have looked at different ways and means to get rid of the alternative media. Sometimes the alternative media can be its own worst enemies, of course, too. We have to take a look at that when it comes to a lot of the channels. You know, we have to be careful about these knee-jerk reactions that everything's a false flag. It dilutes the power of real false flags when we get into that. So we have to know where those levels are. But in any case, the kind of free speech that's offered through these different channels and through the alternative media should never be hindered by some corporate operation. That said, it's on their platform. And unfortunately, if we think they're going to play by the rules the way a public utility or something would, they're going to do what's in their best interest. This is what we've learned. And so we shouldn't be surprised that this happens. The sweep of the effect and the kind of amount of channels that were hit or taken down, people like Jerome Corsi, and it gives us an idea that they were after a particular target, which was this conservative, you know, anyone who's sort of calling out the deep state on one level or another. And whatever those channels were, or whether you agree with them or not, of course, they should have a voice and they should be able to do their own thing. And so YouTube shouldn't be a place that quiets dissent when it doesn't fit into their program. But, you know, people like Eric Schmidt, a close relationship to DARPA, close relationship to the State Department. I think his wife is a member of Obama's State Department when he was in office. So, you know, this is the kinds of things that we almost expect. And they are corporate entities. They try to make it seem like they're part of your normal world. And, you know, here we are talking right now on YouTube. And I've enjoyed YouTube tremendously, because I do think it offers all those things. And I think that if it runs away from those principles of just letting, you know, I mean, there are always limits and there are always kind of strikes that you can get for bucking those limits, you know, and some people would try. But I think for sensible channels where the discourse is at, you know, when things get heavy or conversations get heavy after the school shooting, okay, But in truth, it doesn't really go with YouTube's image to just kind of get rid of these people. Now, Google, after the election of 2016, where Hillary Clinton took such a tremendous toss at the hands of Donald Trump when everyone was saying she was going to win by so much, Google adopted a policy of trying to kind of get rid of the alternative media and paint them as fake news and all that stuff. And we can see that they've continued to have problems with it. So all we can do is kind of keep an eye on it. What I recommend people do in terms of my channel, you know, with all our subscribers, we have a very robust subscriber base at darkjournalist.com and on this YouTube channel. But because darkjournalist.com is assured, and that's something that I can control and broadcast from, I'd recommend that people sign up there. You know, take the time. It's a free newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com so that if anything does happen on YouTube, it's a lot easier to stay updated on what's happening. And of course, we'll deliver videos to you, even if I'm broadcasting from a smartphone. So that's never going to be a worry. But I think it does have a chilling effect when we're looking at major corporate moves to take a group that they don't like and trim them down, hem them in. And the fact is, there is great room in this whole structure of online social media to create something totally new. So of course it's an opportunity, and that's how we should take it. And it's always opportunity and competition that makes these people back off. So instead of looking at it and trying to say, well, an Internet Bill of Rights will help us get YouTube to behave themselves, it's not true, because they're a corporate entity. And if you're using their product, they can do whatever they want with it, unfortunately. And but we'll take note that they are certainly adopting a certain type of approach, a certain type of attitude towards that alternative media and supporting the mainstream media. And that's not going to win them a lot of new fans on our side. What I've understood about YouTube is that they're also positioning themselves to be a television station, you know, sort of like the ultimate cable channel with all these options. So they may be going through there, and you know, they've worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center to flag certain channels that might have objectionable content. And the SPLC has a reputation of just kind of calling everyone a white supremacist, or having all these different issues with conservative groups because it's ultra liberal. So it's not really a good objective arbiter of those types of situations. So I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. And I think in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing to get too panicked about, because there are so many outlets, and it will just allow something else to grow. There's Vimeo, of course, BitChute, and people are using these different ones. There are lots of outlets besides YouTube. I really enjoy YouTube and the fact that we have the ability to interact like this. And, you know, I'd rather not change. I'd rather go to those channels that are on YouTube. So this is the nature of the situation that we're in. It's evolving because this is new media. And we have to figure out, in the grand scheme of things, where we can broadcast from, where we can't be interfered with on any level. And as some of these social media companies like Facebook and like YouTube sort of go on and, you know, hunker down and really cozy up to the political establishment. And in this case, you know, it's the Democratic political establishment, but you can see them doing it for the kind of, you know, Republican side as well. It's really, you know, it's a question of, in the grand scheme of things, you're going to have to be ready for them to pull the rug out from you, as we saw this week. So to those channels that got taken down, I would say, you know, bear up and create a new environment for what you're doing, because if they're going to flag your content along that line. For me, we've been doing this enough that we have a good, robust base. And if they take down, you know, if anything happened, they took down our YouTube channel, we could do the whole thing from darkjournalist.com, and we will. So, you know, we'll see what happens, but I'm not anticipating any issues. It all depends on what happens, and who knows, those guys might back down. There was an article actually in the Drudge Report saying that YouTube had mistakenly taken many of these channels down because they were incorrectly flagged, you know, these more conservative style channels. So it's a very interesting situation. Of course, we have Olivia doing the moderating tonight and doing a great job. Thank you, Olivia. And we don't have Alexandra. Alexandra's coming back tomorrow night, and she's doing better, so thanks for asking. And she and I will have Grant Cameron on, who's going to discuss the Bob Emenegger documentary and this Nixon wave of disclosure from the early 70s, which I'm going to get into here as well. So it's a very exciting week. I call this the mega broadcast because we're doing this show here tonight. Then I'm going over, we're doing the Coast to Coast show with Linda Moulton Howe. And that's from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock a.m. And then tomorrow night, we're doing our own 2-hour broadcast with Grant Cameron. So that's a lot of dark journalist content. If you've been looking to really get a lot of these ideas together in one spot, then we're really kind of broadcasting heavy in the next couple of days. And this is really it. I mean, we're getting really behind the story because what I'm finding is Robert Merritt's story has a number of dimensions to it that the more we explore it, the more support there is for it. Now, his story in a nutshell is that as a member of the Huston plan, he was taken to the White House, beneath the White House, these late night meetings with Nixon that took place. And he was given these instructions about projects and things to do. And they were pretty hardcore covert assignments. I mean, Merritt is no saint, and he did some very, very questionable things working for this plan, but he was, sort of working for this covert arm of the government, and that was his job. So during the third meeting, which took place after Watergate, and which is documented in my exclusive interview with him, which is on this YouTube channel, and I recommend you watch it, Nixon came forward and realized he was going to be defeated by the situation, and very dramatically read this letter out loud called The Message to the American People. And he read it to Merritt, and in there was information about this alien presence that Nixon had interacted with as part of the government, and that they'd been doing it for over 20 years, and that they had a being in custody, or the way he called it, under their protection. And now anyone who's done this or been involved in the UFO field understands that Nixon was very close to the UFO file, and was, aside from Eisenhower, on that presidential level, I can't think of anyone that I think would know more than he did about the alien presence, but I think he wanted control of it. And getting close to that UFO file, there were so many forces around it, particularly military contractors. And this took place in the 1950s when, they went from a situation where Harry Truman was getting these regular briefings, and he was getting them quarterly about these crashes and this wave of sightings and things along that line. And what happened was, gradually, as Eisenhower got in there, he knew a lot about it. He knew all about the Foo Fighters and everything else. And he tried to get a handle on what we should do with it, and basically put Nixon in charge of a program. And what happened was, Eisenhower, at a certain point, ran into physical difficulties. He had a heart attack, and then a quick stroke happened, and he was incapacitated for a couple of months. During that period, Nixon assumed the presidency. So we're talking about the mid-50s. And they say that during this period is when that UFO file slipped away. That's when it went into this weird, shady area. They call it a breakaway civilization, the deep state. It went into this field where it was kind of between corporate power and political power, deep underground political power. So it's kind of a fascinating situation and a fascinating dynamic that was happening there. Nixon, by 1958, had gotten into these situations. It was a very interesting whistleblower that came to Linda Moulton Howe. And I found this fascinating. It's always one of those amazing, interesting stories. And when this guy finally came out, they brought him out actually at the, the citizens' hearing for a disclosure, which was an event run by Steve Bassett and was really the last powerful event around the UFO field, in my opinion. There are conferences and stuff, but that was the last major event where they tried to do this kind of congressional hearings on UFOs, the way they had done them in the 60s. And it makes sense. It's an issue that really has to be addressed for a number of reasons. And you would want it to go to a political desk. And the fact that it's not is that absurd kind of secrecy situation that we're all living with. And it's a schizophrenic situation, as Catherine Austin Fitts points out, when you have trillions of dollars in hardware flying over your head and there's no explanation for it on the ground, and then you have all this missing money from these different agencies, then you know that we're experiencing some issues. So anyway, I've been looking in different biographies of Eisenhower, of Nixon, to find some reference to this time capsule that might have just been stuck in there by accident or forgotten, whatever. And I found some incredible passages. I'm going to read them to you briefly. One of them comes from Being Nixon, which is actually a good book by Evan Thomas. Thomas really, as a Washington bureau chief at Newsweek and stuff, is one of these total Council on Foreign Relations guys, like really toes the line. And you wouldn't expect to get kind of deep state truth out of him. But in here, he has a fascinating passage about when Nixon was vice president. And so I'll just read this out. He says, in 1953, after his first few months in the White House, President Eisenhower wrote out a list for Project X. Now, of course, the name is pretty fascinating considering Merritt's testimony about X, but we'll go back into that. So he says, President Eisenhower wrote out a list for Project X, a secret recollection of his presidency to be deposited in a time capsule at his Gettysburg farm. The first item was Nixon. This is interesting for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's 1953, which means he just got in office, so he's already planning ahead. Second of all, there's a time capsule that he deposited at the Gettysburg farm, and I've done some research on that. And also that Nixon is the first item in the time capsule. All very peculiar. So it goes on from there, but I think that that's really the main reference from that book. This book, which is The President and the Apprentice, has a very interesting, this is a particularly good book, by the way. It's Irwin F. Gilman, and it's Eisenhower and Nixon, 1952 to 1961, because what everyone has to understand is that Nixon and Eisenhower are very strange bedfellows. Nixon, the consummate politician, Eisenhower, the general that a lot of these, love America, business interests, oil guys had convinced to run for president in 52 after the Democrats had held the presidency since FDR. So that's 20 years of Democratic rule, and they just felt they were getting the short end of the stick. Now, I would say that I think what's interesting about this is that Eisenhower had a conversation with Churchill. And in that conversation, they discussed the UFO file. And this was related later by a bodyguard of Winston Churchill's who said, talking about what should we do about this? And they were like, after the war, these guys, the public, can't handle this. And they were talking about the foundation of religious thought, things along this line. And we know this comes up a lot. I mean, discovering aliens, I don't think would destroy religious thought. It might strengthen it in many ways. So I don't know why this always comes up in this fashion. I mean, I can see them being worried about transferring the authority, of instead of saying we're the most powerful, that some weird alien off-planet group visiting here has better technology. So, there is that. But this thing about religion, I mean, maybe they've studied it more than I have. I don't think that religious people would lose their faith because they discovered an off-world civilization. I'll put it that way. But in any case, they had this conversation and they decided, yeah, we're not going to put these reports out. And what I found is that there are reports all the way back to FDR talking about crashes and things like that. So, we know the UFO field from 1947 on. And so this one, we're really looking at something that goes a lot further back. So, we can always kind of time capsule and say we've got about 70 years here. That's enough, I guess. But just going into the modern wave, I'd say FDR is a good place to start. All right, so Gilman, he has a very similar quote. Let's see if I can find it here. And again, this is from The President and the Apprentice, which, if you want to know about that period, is a really good book, actually. So, quote, sometime that spring or summer, the president made a handwritten list for Project X, possibly the time capsule located at his Gettysburg farm. Item number 1 was Nixon. And this is what he thought of Nixon: energetic, physically strong, politically astute, ambitious, good personality. Only weakness I can detect is that he's very fond of nightlife in Washington, sometimes has a bedraggled morning appearance. Well, I think Nixon was just stuck with that. It was the nature of who he was. And apparently he couldn't drink. That was another thing. So it wasn't from hanging out late at night. However, what we learn from Bob Haldeman's wife in her biography is that, in fact, Nixon had terrible insomnia and was in the habit of calling Haldeman, who was his chief of staff and really the kind of tight Mr. Loyalty on that team. He would have him come down and say, you know, I need you to come down here. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. We have to talk. And so these calls would disrupt their sleeping patterns, disrupt their lives. And this was the nature of what was going on at that time. So we get a little bit of a glimpse there of Nixon's insomnia, which does come into play when we're talking about Robert Merritt and his amazing revelations. So we're in an interesting situation there. Now, what I would take from these references to this time capsule is that Nixon, when he's faced with political oblivion of Watergate, he's been moving in the direction of this UFO disclosure, as we found out from the fact that he supported, with the Department of Defense, this whole documentary that Bob Ebenegger was directing, and which came out eventually, called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. And I have something on that. Of course, they changed the name briefly, re-put it out in 1979. It had Jacques Vallée, and it still had Rod Serling in it, even though he had passed away in 1975. So originally, the version that they came out with, 75, took everything out. There was all this footage that was promised from Holloman Air Force Base. And I got into that in the last episode because it's very important to tie that in to Merritt's revelations, because we understand the whole thing better. I think we're in a better situation. And we can kind of get the understanding that Merritt's situation and his conversation with Nixon does not take place in a vacuum. That's very important. And so it's something that we need to take a look at when we look at that era and say, why did the Nixon administration have Bald Haldeman go to his friend who worked for Gray Advertising? And that was all connected with different intelligence outlets, by the way. So they knew who to go to there. Why did he have him do this? And what were they planning? Why were they saying to Ebenegger, you're going to get this incredible footage of a landing where these beings come out and they talk to military officials at Holloman Air Force Base? Now, one of the interesting things is, it's funny too, because in my conversation with Linda Moulton Howe, who I'll be on Coast to Coast AM radio tonight with, she was telling me, listen, they never give you the straight story on Holloman Air Force Base. It took place at the White Sands testing range. That's interesting because it makes sense to me that they wouldn't really identify where it happened. So she always has kind of the good edge on that, I would say. The other thing that I think is important in looking and reviewing this whole story is that Ebenegger himself sort of talks about it in this bemused fashion. And he's in these specials 20, 30 years later. And he has a standing invitation to come on this program, of course. He's still around and doing his stuff. And he's been involved with so many movies. Excuse me. And he's really, it's an unusual chapter, let's say, of his life, because you can see he has these credits and all these different comedy specials, and he does music and all this other stuff. So when we get into this period where he's working on these Department of Defense documentaries, and they spring on him, look, you're going to do this Department of Defense documentary on UFOs and check it out. We're going to give you this whole swath, all this material and footage from this landing, which I think is particularly interesting. That makes us understand when you get into these basement, deep underground meetings that Merritt had with Nixon. They make sense because Nixon is planning, he's cultivating his own intelligence unit to run right out of the White House. When he's talking about the ET presence, well, he's been working right here on a documentary to get it out to the public, and he muses about things like a third term. He was probably going to say, look, I opened Russia, I opened China, now I need to tell you about this. That's why I need a third term on America's centennial. This is another thing that was coming up, 1976. Now, the bicentennial came up, and it was a major push to reenact the patriotism of the United States. You know, we'd gone through Vietnam, gone through the Kennedy assassination, Kent State, all these terrible, soul-destroying things. About the only good thing that was coming through that period was the music and the creative expression that was going on, which was phenomenal. But really, as a country, I would say we were having tremendous problems. And when you look back at that period, and I talk to people and spend time with like Professor Peter Dale Scott, for example, they will tell you that it's basically like a war, you know, that their phones are tapped. It's a little more obvious because now if they want to surveil you, they just pop into your email or, you know, it's this nature of the situation. It's kind of hop on your cell phone. It's easier. Back then, there's like wiretaps and people taking your mail. And so it's a real visceral situation. And I think that when we get into that period, it's a very manipulated period because there's a faction that's involved with the deep state that wants to get rid of the peace movement. The peace movement of people like Eugene McCarthy, who's running for president in 1968. These are intellectual, almost erudite people. And what they need to do is take that and sort of drug it up and really present it to the public as this terrible mess of these people who have no morals and all this stuff. And there's a lot of hangers-on in the hippie movement that are happy to oblige them. But we know a lot of that situation is manipulated. And there's been so many stories like Laurel Canyon and different studies about the 60s and how the peace movement was manipulated. And I have no doubt that that's true. So when we're getting into the Nixon period, they are in this kind of standoff with those protesters because they're pursuing in the best interest of the United States, according to them. They're doing this thing. Now, Nixon is accomplishing some things that no presidents have been able to touch. The SALT talks and the SALT II talks, these are arms limitations around nuclear weapons. Now, I want to point out here that President Putin of Russia comes forward today and says, Russia has these new nuclear weapons. They're 40 times faster than the speed of light. We could annihilate the US if we had to. You know, and really kind of bellicose language that sounds more like Nikita Khrushchev. Now, I find this fascinating because Putin has been kind of, you know, on the receiving end for a while. This is some punching back. And, you know, him calling out some of those tactics would be one thing. But these guys on these levels are speaking so irresponsibly on the nuclear aspect of this, you know, and we get this whole thing about the North Koreans talking in this bellicose way. We have this nuclear weapon and, you know, Trump saying, well, I'll annihilate you if you do that. I mean, it's getting into this point where, you know, we have to stop and reflect and say, look, the Cold War is over and we dealt with this problem around nuclear weapons. And now we're dealing with all these nuclear proliferation questions again. And here we have Putin, who, like I said, I do think was being kind of bullied in a sense. And, you know, the Clinton Secretary of State, the Obama administration, they were doing things and they were souring that relationship. But it doesn't help your cause if you're Putin and there are people in America who say, you know, hey, we should really lay off the Russians and not give them a hard time because they don't want to import or use GMOs and things like that. It doesn't help when you come out and you make these threatening announcements and you say, hey, I have these missiles and Russia's back and like we're nuclear and we're in your face and it's the Cold War all over again. I don't know where that rhetoric is going or the kind of intel that he was shown to make those statements. But I do feel that it's incredibly counterproductive. And we're back kind of in the same situation that Jack Kennedy faced in the early 60s. This is where the UFO disclosure question comes in, because it would be a game changer. And we all have different parts of it, I think, in these different countries, including China, by the way. We can't rule out the fact that these other countries have redeveloped this material as well as we have. I have no question, especially after reading through all the various transcripts about these conversations that take place on that deep level about it, that we have the superior edge when it comes to the UFO technology, which may be one of the tight reasons why we keep a tight lid on it. We don't want that information out. It is a major defense secret. However, the peoples of the world, looking at the situation, there are energy aspects to this. Of course, we can't continue on the oil paradigm, and things like fracking delay the inevitable and destroy the environment. So what are we really talking about here? I can't guarantee you that, by coming out with the alien question, that they'll solve all the energy issues, because of those energy companies are all in competition. But I can tell you the whole conversation is being spun. And I'm going to get back to the Nixon aspect of this, but I want to get into this article that came out. And I literally, I think I have Susan Manowich to thank for this. She's the president of the New Energy Movement. And we've had on here as a guest before, and she's just incredible with the work that she's doing. But she pointed out an article that was in Newsweek. And this is more of what I call coercion disclosure. This is the UFO coercion. We saw some of the coercion with the Academy to the Stars guys. And what they were doing was they were trying to make it hip and cool for the CIA and some billionaire marketers to run the UFO thing based on people's interests. I'm not even sure that they cared very much about it. There was a hidden reason and a hidden aspect in there. Those small group wants to try to figure out how to market some of that advanced technology, or at least the idea about it. And the marketers won the day, which is why we got the clumsy rollout. And the CIA tried to go along with this and force that on everyone. And it had actually been going on for a while with the TTSA. I mean, I know it came to a head when they announced that they had this October, thing. And they had the main rollout with DeLong. And then DeLong stumbled along the way. And we pointed out that every time he showed up, there were more CIA guys around him. And the UFO field generally, they had a really hard time with that, because they were kind of like, anyone who talks against this disclosure is an enemy. I have a very simple rule, which is when the CIA starts popping up all over the place around something, they take a real good look at it. And that's what I did. And that's where we came up with a series of shows about the DeLong thing. Now, we know that they've done a number of deceptive things. Like they put out this sailor talking about these different things that happened to him. And they always show footage of a different UFO case next to him. And I've done those shows, and that information is back there if you want to go through it. And Elizondo and his ridiculous story about being disgruntled. And Elizondo, of course, goes on George Knapp the other night. And it's, it was a pretty laughable performance, I have to say, because there was no tough questions. And every time there was anything like a tough question, he said basically, it almost sounded like he said, I'm moving on. Or, he's like, oh, I've taken a chance. I think I have to start a new segment on this show, and I'm going to call it Poor CIA Guy. And poor CIA guy, Louis Elizondo, claims that he put his pension at risk by releasing this stuff. But then again, he says, well, wait a minute, the films weren't classified. So, in fact, one of the films had been on YouTube as early as 2007. So what exactly would you get into trouble over? This is what I keep trying to figure out. If I could have 10 minutes with Elizondo, I would ask him very simply, you still have a contractual relationship with the CIA? No one asked him that question. I don't understand. George Knapp has had him for hours and hours. George Knapp, I have to take a little aside here and say that he's spoken so well on the UFO issue for so long, brought us Bob Lazar, brought Area 51, which was a deep black site, into the public eye. So, it's funny because my dad had a saying that he said, you're only as good as your last day. And it's true. The deal is, I can do years and years of good stuff, but if I start dropping the ball, it's going to affect what I'm doing, and it's going to affect everything else that came before also. So we have to be careful when we're dealing with these people from the DIA, the CIA, and the NSA crowding around the UFO issue, and billionaires like Bigelow and then Harry Reid, who they put out there. They thought, hey, maybe we can save this whole thing with Harry Reid, and we're doing it. And Harry Reid was coming out and saying, hey, the truth is out there in tweets. And I expected to see, Reid come out and say, hey, I'm an emo fan too. It was just like a transformation of this guy into like a truthful, a real freedom fighter. And we see a lot of that these days because they know people hunger for truth, and they're trying to prop these really kind of corrupt ex-politicians out for it. My point is, the apparatus around the CIA and the intelligence agencies getting into the UFO issue is cause for concern, and for a number of reasons. Now, I'm going to read you from this article from Newsweek, and it's the most unusual issue, and I'll show you how they conflate these two issues. So this is right out of Newsweek, and the name of the article is What UFO Encounters Can Tell Us About Fake News and Climate Change Denial, and they put encounters in quotes. You can see that. All right, so I'll rush through this. People often mistake Kate Dorsch for someone who studies aliens, but Dorsch actually studies something else. A doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a nice university. She's been researching UFO reports collected by the U.S. government. Oh, that's not interesting. So now we have universities studying UFO sightings for the government. Sounds like Blue Book and some of the other things. The Air Force program began compiling these accounts during the early stages of the Cold War as part of a program called Project Blue Book. Well, thank you. In 1966, it hired the University of Colorado to further investigate stories of alien encounters by ordinary Americans. Project Blue Book ended 3 years later. And the American Philosophical Society eventually achieved part of the project. Archived the project in Philadelphia. So 3 years ago, Dorsch, a historian, dug through the archives. She found bags of dirt from where flying saucers purportedly landed and a piece of foil that someone said fell off a UFO. In the process, she discovered another story, one about the struggle between the UFO witnesses and the scientists who didn't believe them, a struggle that speaks to more recent debates over climate change and fake news. Okay, forget about the fake news for a second. Climate change. So, they used to have this fantastic commercial years ago, and it's, you've got chocolate in my peanut butter. No, you've got peanut butter in my chocolate, about Reese's peanut butter cups. Two tastes that taste great together. Well, I'll tell you, this was really interesting. I was like, you're going to do climate change with the UFO thing. Let's see if we can reach people and convince them about our version of UFOs by appealing to their climate change sensibility. In the archived accounts, Dorsch says, earnest believers in UFOs had trouble explaining what they saw, mysterious objects, bright lights, and odd shapes in the sky. But the scientists involved in the project consider them crackpots and doggedly try to negate the idea of flying saucers. Well, they did a lot worse than that. Let's not forget the Men in Black. We'll start there. Dorsch says she was struck by how hard people work to dissuade the gullible American public from believing in this. See the kind of contrary nature of this statement? She was struck by how hard people work, that is, these experts and so on, to dissuade the gullible, not the public, but the gullible American public from believing in this. Very unusual statement. And here we go again. Now, tying UFO disclosure to climate change. Let's go further. This is more from the article. But inside these responses, Dorsch also saw scientists trying to figure out how to communicate to lay people. Yes, the peasants. You have to learn how to talk to the peasants, right? In the documents, for example, academics offered UFO witnesses better ways to tell their stories. Can you use this chart to tell us how bright that light was? What coin best describes the size of the object? If it was the size of a coin, then it probably wasn't a flying saucer. Meanwhile, the observers urged the scientists to take them seriously, so on and so forth. The rift between debunkers and believers has its roots in the evolution of science. For centuries, scientific discovery was about simple observation, taking notes, making predictions, things anyone could do. By the mid-1900s, science had fractured into subfields with its own requirements for expertise. The shift left people vulnerable to charlatans, people who fake their credentials and promote ideas that other scientists consider incorrect. Now, I'm going on with this because there's a payoff, and it is all about this climate change combination. Snake oil is much more palatable when it's sold by someone whose name is followed with MD. Dorsch points to guests on the TV show Ancient Aliens who call themselves doctors and have a list of published books attached to their names. Well, I'm sure if they call themselves doctors on that show, I mean, they are doctors of some kind. They might not be, a medical doctor, but they're usually doctors, maybe a doctor of philosophy. But of course, comparing the UFO field to Ancient Aliens is kind of ridiculous too. There's so many things going on with that. That's a produced show. A lot of the producers, even of Ancient Aliens, don't even believe in the subject. They just like ratings, so it expresses interest. And my own feeling is that show pretty much around 2012 or so saw its best days. But anyway, the division over what constitutes authority, Dorsch says, means people need to pay more attention to where they get their facts. Who you trust, she says, changes the information that you have. And it also leads people to seize any opportunity to crush opposing viewpoints. Take, for example, minor quibbles among scientists about climate change. Okay. Okay, so we're getting climate change again. This is a real test balloon. Okay, here's the end of it. Newer, more accurate ways of measuring and modeling temperatures make it look as if the planet has warmed more slowly than scientists expected, and yada, yada, yada. The end is the recent clashes over fake news and climate change denial bear a startling resemblance to the clash on display in the UFO archives. Really, I mean, this is quite remarkable. And there's this ending thing. It ends on this note, too, where it goes, what is essentially on trial is the qualifications of expertise, she says. It's only a matter of time before someone comes along and says, I hear you. All right, there's a really anticlimactic ending to her article. Here's the trial balloon, folks. Why on earth is Newsweek, a publication which trounces anything about the deep state, anything about UFOs, anything deep, and just wants you on this little roller coaster of issues like transgender bathrooms and things like that? Why are they taking this tremendous effort to bring the UFO aspect in this article with climate change? Again, there's more things around the UFO aspect. What do climate change people worry about the most? The erosion of the environment. Well, it's the energy producing countries that are doing this and refining it and so on and destroying it. There's a huge answer in the UFO file about breakthrough energy. That appeals, or could appeal, to the climate change crowd if you could get them on board with the idea of a government handling a UFO file. And also bringing it to them and saying, yes, all those people who've had these cases and all that stuff, they were stupid, or they didn't have the expertise or whatever, and they need scientists to show them. But if I can get your trust by saying I believe in climate change, for example, then I can certainly have you on board, with this idea of getting this breakthrough energy and solving the energy crisis. And here's my new backdoor to the UFO subject. So it's a weird move afoot. Now, there's another article that came out in Wired magazine that basically debunked the videos that we saw from the To the Stars Academy, which I found quite fascinating. But next on that list, they got into Robert Bigelow. They started talking about all the stuff about Bigelow in the 90s. And I counted 3 major stories on the UFO subject. That stuff comes in waves. That is, when they have this story, when they have this narrative they're pushing through, they move it through these different avenues and venues and say, hey, it's okay to talk about those UFOs. Ever since the New York Times did it, it's cool. But where is that coming from? Where is TTSA coming from? Well, we see there's an effort on the part of the CIA to control the issue. There's a point on these marketing groups trying to promote it and make money from it. And there's that squeeze in the middle where there are some good researchers trying to suss the issue out. my work and the things that I'm doing, we're so fortunate to have Merritt come forward, because Merritt's time capsule and the information that it contains about Nixon handling the UFO file and us managing the alien presence and getting all these incredible things from that interaction for 20 years at that time with scientists at Los Alamos and this being that they were working with. Now, that would lead you to believe that this is an important thing for Nixon. He's looking at it and he's saying, this is my place in history. This is what I was going to do for a third term. That's why he's funding and putting out the Emmenegger documentary. That's why he's saying to the Department of Defense, do this. That's why Bob Haldeman is, working with his friend Emmenegger. And, that's another thing too, which is Emmenegger and Haldeman were friends. So it's a direct pipeline into the president. So we have an incredible range of things here. We've got the Hunt statement that Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give away our most vital secret, which was the UFO, the alien presence, the UFO file, the knowledge of the UFO file to the Soviet Union. There's a lot of things coming to the surface here. And, that information is there. I think that what we have to do now is take a real look at what it is. We have the information. We have aspects of the information. Merritt's story coming forward gives us the Nixon disclosure. The time capsule message, if we could recover it, and there is a process set forward right now going through official channels trying to get it. There will be other processes employed in terms of contacts to make this happen. But if that were brought forward now, it would give the Trump administration the ability to say, well, President Nixon stored this information. He wanted to bring it forward. And so we're going to honor that request. And we're going to bring this up to speed. Then they can do their own version of what the Clinton administration was trying to do. These sides, the Republican and Democratic side, and in the Trump camp, it's almost like the independent side, because he's not quite a Republican, because I can almost think the main Republicans almost dislike him as much as the other Republicans do, because Trump is not going along with their program. Whatever one might think of President Trump, he's not acting like a traditional Republican. I mean, tax cuts, sure, but certainly the Clinton administration and Hillary Clinton was sounding way more bellicose on things like Russia and all the rest of it coming into the election. And when they lost, I think it was a real knockout punch for this disclosure push by the Podesta people and all that. But remember, both Trump and Clinton and these different moves for disclosure are trying to access something that's deep. It's a part of a deep program. And in my opinion, it's managed by the people who operate the continuity of government program. Now, I could do a whole show on COG, and I have kind of a show that sizes it up pretty well, which is the SSP and COG, the Secret Space Program and Continuity of Government Program that I ran back in October. Kind of spells it out. But what we see in a nutshell with continuity of government players, these people have been around since the 50s. They're part of something called a doomsday network. That is, if we ever get ourselves into a nuclear situation at that time with the Russians, they were going to run the government from underground bunkers and rebuild the world. And it was our attempt to survive a nuclear war, which sounds like madness, except that today you have people like Putin and, our friend in North Korea saying these things. So these channels and that whole apparatus, that whole push for underground development had a national security purpose. But after a while, those channels could be utilized by people who had other reasons. And Professor Peter Dale Scott, who believes a great deal and coined the term the deep state, doesn't ever talk about UFOs, but we can use his research to form a better picture for ourselves. By the way, if you want to get well-schooled in the deep state or well-schooled in political swordsmanship, you have to read the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott. The American Deep State is a must. But it's a hard book to get now, but I think the paperback is out, so it is easier to get. There is this thing about continuity of government, and I would put it this way. Continuity of government players from Winston Lawson, who was part of that, he set up the route that Kennedy took in Dallas. He was the Secret Service agent that did that. John Dean, who plays a very key role in the demise of Nixon, also a continuity of government player. Oliver North, one of the main continuity of government players. Dick Cheney, before he was vice president, before he was defense secretary, continuity of government player. Donald Rumsfeld, continuity of government player, when he was CEO of a chemical company, not even a government role at that point, still called in to create that. Under Nixon, they had the continuity of government players deep throughout the administration, but they had their own mind about how to do things, which is why they're often showing up around the deep events in history. One of the things we can say also about Iran-Contra and these things that come out in the Reagan administration is that's all Oliver North. So here again, continuity of government is doing it. They're kind of like a shadow government operating underground. And the way that they're described is that it's people take their hands and they use these channels. By the time you get to 9/11, you have Cheney utilizing the continuity of government. Now, continuity of government hasn't been brought up in the U.S. Senate. As a matter of fact, the only time it was brought up was when Oliver North was testifying, and there's Senator Daniel Inouye who tells him, you can't talk about that. You basically stop right there at the water's edge. The continuity of government, when we're under a state of emergency, plays a great role, and they can funnel money through it. And in my opinion, and this is something based on the research that I've done, I believe this whole idea about money disappearing through NASA and through HUD, and through the DoD, and large-scale commercial, corporate, private interests going into space are linked. And I think the way that you do it is you funnel and apply the same rules to space that you applied to continuity of government. So you developed a vast underground network, and it's off the books because it's so deep in the national security thing that nobody can get into it. So continuity of government is important for us to keep in mind. I'll keep it on the ground for now. We'll lay off the space side of continuity of government. But I do feel that when we're looking at the Nixon administration, he's opening up China. He's opening up Russia. In my interview today, Douglas Caddy talks about how that foreign policy could very well have been in lieu of the fact that they were about to disclose, and they needed all these countries on board with them. Of course, we've seen Gorbachev and Reagan had these discussions. That's on record. It's no longer somebody's conspiracy theory or something. So what are they talking about? What are they talking about defending against, collaborating with? Now, you're not going to catch China coming out and saying, we found this stuff, or Russia saying it, because everyone waits for the United States because they know that we have the kind of treasure trove in this department. And there is a national security aspect to it. I wouldn't deny it. But there comes a point when the secrecy wall doesn't work, and that's what I think all these different groups are deciding. But the Nixon administration decided that, and he was making moves toward it. And when he got thwarted in that department, he came forward and he did something kind of interesting, which has preserved it for history so that he would still be that disclosure president. He wouldn't get the third term. He'd be disgraced, but he had this one thing that he could kind of use against them. And I think it's possible, and this is speculation, that it could very well have been used as leverage to stay out of prosecution for Watergate, because there's really no reason for Ford to grant Nixon a pardon, because it'll dim his chances for re-election in '76. And there are a lot of different theories about why that happened. There's a book by Seymour Hersh, etc. And Hersh is famous for digging out the story that the 82nd Airborne was going to be called in during that impeachment process to rescue Nixon, and that Alexander Haig was looking to do this. The drama around Nixon getting thrown out of office after doing these amazing things and bringing America to these great heights, negotiating with the Soviets, negotiating with China, things no one had been able to do. He'd gone to Russia, he'd gone to China. It was remarkable, and it was a totally different type of foreign policy than anything that we got. And regardless of if someone's a fan of Nixon or not, the diplomatic achievements and foreign policy achievements are undeniable. So the point is, we have a structure to look at, which is Nixon putting this away under this environment. He's got the idea, we've seen it from the Eisenhower time capsule. He took a lot from Eisenhower. He's thinking, I can preserve this thing. Now, what about the late night meetings? Why are they grabbing Merritt at 1 o'clock in the morning and rushing him down? Well, we found out through Haldeman's wife, Nixon had terrible insomnia. He's working on problems late at night. Eisenhower said even as vice president, he had a haggard appearance in the morning because the guy couldn't sleep. He had this kind of mind that was working all the time. So there's a lot of supportive evidence for what's going on in this Merritt interaction. When I talked to Merritt, and he said exclusively on the record for the first time in any public broadcast that Nixon had hid this time capsule in the White House, I asked him point blank, do you think that it's still there? Which is, of course, the crucial question. And he was absolutely convinced because of the cleverness of the way that Nixon hid it. Of course, anyone who's been following the story knows that through Douglas Caddy, we made the offer to the National Archives to give directions to the time capsule to have it opened on the condition that it's read aloud to the public and distributed to the media. Seems pretty fair and a good deal for them because, of course, they can take possession of the document. It's in Nixon's hand, so there'll be no question about legibility or authenticity, for example. Of course, you could say there is a chance that it's not there and that Merritt's confidence shouldn't be what it is. Well, I went into this in depth with Linda Moulton Howe, and that's kind of like the part 2 of this one. That will be the focus of that episode, and talking deep about what Merritt revealed out of those meetings and what was inside the time capsule and the things that Nixon did during reading the letter. I do think that Robert Merritt, and coming forward with his health conditions, is a game changer, and that people who are interested in moving this subject forward need to press the story, get it out there, and get people on it. Actually, we're in this process now, and I'm going to spend a lot of time getting this story out because I do believe in it, and it's so important. So we're going to take some questions here in a minute, but I do want to point everyone to Coast to Coast AM tonight with Linda Moulton Howe. She's done an amazing job setting this up, and I'm going to work closely with her. We're going to, we've done a lot of setting up for that whole special, and she's going to do a couple of hours on it. We're going to do that there. So this is, I think, where we need to go with the story. Look, the time capsule is important. We have a chance, an opportunity to open something that's historic, that everyone can agree upon. How many disagreements have we seen when it comes to different cases or people's testimonies or whatever? We have something here that if we can get a handle on it, if we can get our hands on it, it's sensational. The story is sensational, but it's history changing, and that's the real point. But it also fulfills something, which is if Nixon was moving towards this in 1972, and if it got derailed, much like Kennedy's initiatives got derailed in 63, we're looking at a process, a planned process, in my opinion, to derail that issue until they have a complete lock on space. That is, these deep state warriors. They want the control on space, and they've used the public funding to get it. So we only get a few opportunities, I think, to seize the issue back, and this is one of them. I'm absolutely convinced. I spent a lot of time on the story. Anyone who knows me knows I've spent a lot of time studying the politics around the UFO file and the players involved, and everything from assassinations of those players to removing them from office to trying to get their names out of the history books. And really what we're looking at is an organized effort to keep a really hardcore secret among a very small group, and that people who have, very powerful people who stood up to that, including Nixon, have really been rewarded with getting taken out. And I think that, you know, when we look at this whistleblower that Linda Moulton Howe has talked to, named Cooper, who came forward after 15 years of talking to her during the citizens hearing in 2013, and basically said, look, you know, in 58, I was giving these briefings on the UFO thing because Nixon was in charge of the CIA version of Blue Book. You know, they mentioned Blue Book in the Newsweek article, and we hear about Blue Book over here. You know, in this article, we talk about Blue Book cases. That's the fluff for the public. That's why J. Allen Hynek left and became a real UFO researcher. And by the way, J. Allen Hynek plays a role in that Emmenegger documentary as well. But he knew that they were giving the public to shaft, and they stood him up there and said, you know, say swamp gas. So he understood it. And what we have to do is take a new look at this situation and say, you know, Blue Book was handled on the CIA side. They had the real cases. That's the thing Nixon was in charge of, or at least he thought he was in charge of it. And when he was left office, he, you know, they handed over to Kennedy. Eisenhower tells Kennedy, look, they have this UFO file. They've done a lot of things to keep your hands off it. I've said it in my speech, the military-industrial complex, but you're going to have to get that stuff back. That's going to be a big part of your presidency. And Kennedy does all these different things. And by 1963, he is trying to share that UFO file with the Soviets. And he's saying, give me all the high importance cases. But he's also calling for cooperation in space with the Soviets, totally different from the space race, and very different rhetoric. And so we know how that ended with Kennedy getting assassinated. That's how that deep state protects the UFO secret. That's how that wall works. That's why when you see all these intelligence guys around TTSA and stuff like that, the CIA and intelligence operations and covert operators, they don't want to give you the truth about UFOs. They've had the opportunity for years to do that. What they want to do is give you some kind of version of it. Apparently, they're trying to dole out some version of this, or they're test marketing and sending up test balloons. But in any case, I think we're looking at a situation where we have to be very cautious and really understand that important people in our history have tried to get their hands on this, and they've been blocked by deep state operators. Nixon's case, he got around it with the time capsule. Nixon was smart. He was clever. He was also a great poker player. But he negotiated major nuclear reduction terms for this country with other countries that no other president could do. So I feel that he could pull this off. And I feel that Merritt has a remarkable, truly remarkable track record as a confidential informant. Even the FBI FOIA requests on him, if you look at the documents, he gets incredibly high marks from these people because he does his job well. He remembers things. He's got that incredible memory, which is why they probably grabbed him in the first place for it. He has an incredible document trail. I have this document that I went into. This is from July 5th, 1974, Watergate investigation. And this is to the director of the FBI. And it says, pursuant to the director's instructions, 1974, May 14th, the Office of Planning and Evaluation to conduct a complete analysis of the FBI's conduct of the Watergate and related investigations. The enclosed study has been prepared. And there's all this information on it. And right in the middle of this, we go into this whole thing about Merritt's testimony and how they evaluated Merritt. Now, I found this interesting. I can't get into all this here, but what I'm trying to point out is that unlike a whistleblower who comes out and says, well, I'm part of the secret program and I've been taken to Mars and I'm part of these things, those stories kind of reside here. But if you don't have any track record, then we just have to take you on faith. So we've had all these things about which whistleblower do you believe and all these kinds of things, especially in the UFO field. It's been debated over and over again, and some are more reliable than others. I personally tend to trust contactees and people who've had these experiences and aren't claiming to be part of some super fleet or something along that line. The reason for that is I think that UFOs work on this personal one-on-one basis because I think so much of the phenomena works that way. And although we've discovered off-world officers lists through the work of Gary McKinnon and people like that, trail of space development, I don't think that people in those programs can come out. There's just no, it's not even like an intelligence person coming out and giving this story. You cannot come out of a program that is that secret and talk openly about it, especially on an ongoing basis. That's my personal analysis. So therefore, I'm looking for something with a track record when I'm looking at this area. When I spoke to Merritt and I went deep into his history, this is someone who operated under the Huston plan for the Nixon administration, doing covert work, but who started doing very basic things like memorizing license plates at youth rallies and things like that for these different agencies, FBI, ATF, CIA. This is the kind of thing, it's like a developmental track until you get up to this point. And I also think that given Merritt's disposition, that is, his kind of loyalty to President Nixon even after all this time, I think the reason he came forward to discuss this is because of his ill health. And I honestly feel that the information that he's given is true. Now, the thing about it is, it's easy to prove out because, the document that he said is placed as a time capsule there in the White House, he has the instructions for. So it is this process of getting our hands on that. I do think his testimony standalone is very important because we learned so much. Because if you go through the history of Watergate, if you go through the literature, if you talk to people like the Watergate lawyer Douglas Caddy, if you talk to Jim Hogan, who did the incredible book Secret Agenda in 1984 about Watergate, Caddy, Merritt's in there. Merritt's in their research. They understand Merritt the way that people in the UFO field don't, because they've just been introduced to him. But if you know things, if you study in political forums, if you look at these things, Merritt's going to be a lot more known to you. And Merritt has that background. There are newspaper articles from the 70s about Merritt as an FBI informant. So we have something here which is a rare opportunity. We have someone very close to the Nixon administration, very close to the Watergate incident. And he's largely known, let's face it, for his Watergate testimony and the things that he said about Watergate. And they are compelling, especially since he was the main informant for the military intelligence person who was a police officer named Carl Schaffler, who arrested the burglars. So he's that close. There's no denying it. There's no saying, oh, he didn't know Schaffler or something like that. It's a matter of public record. You could say Merritt never went to the White House and, beneath the White House and had those meetings because there aren't any logs. They don't keep logs of that kind of secret meeting. But the fact that he was used as a courier of sensitive material, that you can prove. So, we can see all these different connections with Merritt. When he comes forward and he says these things about meeting Nixon, about the message to the American people, about the time capsule, we have something that we can lay our hands on with his story. And I think that he's got the background and that the story makes sense also because of the Emmenegger documentary and the Nixon administration giving Emmenegger unprecedented access to the Department of Defense to make a UFO documentary. Of course, they pulled all that back after Watergate, and it came out a little more half-baked. But this is why I think the story is important, while I'll spend the time on it. And when I am talking with Linda Moulton Howe about it tonight on Coast to Coast AM, she's bringing it around. Think of Linda Moulton Howe's career. 4 decades of incredible research, cattle mutilations, contactee cases, government whistleblowers. She knows the story. She understands the value, the importance of the time capsule. And she has ideas of her own about how to get at it. And we're going to talk about those. So let's take a few questions. We're going to move into it. I'm going to turn things over to Olivia. And
okay,
you are.
It is chaos. All right. So the first question is, can you tell everybody the time for Coast to Coast tonight?
Yeah, Coast to Coast starts at 1 a.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Pacific. But there's kind of a George News segment that starts the show out, and then I think they're talking to Stephen Bassett. And then Linda's segment starts a little before 2 a.m., which is a little before 11 o'clock on Coast to Coast, and it's a 3-hour segment. And I'm doing 2 of those 3 hours.
I'm going to ask the big question up front, which is, Greg McHaas, So
Okay.
Dark J, what is your agenda? Why are you doing this work? Maybe you should tell your viewers why you are doing what you are doing. I think a lot of people would like to know.
Do you have a couple of hours? It's like when I asked Charlie Fultz when I met him accidentally and I didn't know who he was, and I said, "What are you going to be on TV for?" And he said, "Oh, you sure you want the answer to that?" And I said, "Yeah." We talked for about 3 hours. Of course, he was one of the guys in the Allagash incident. Well, I've worked in mainstream media, and I've worked in alternative media, and I've always been a dark journalist, though. That is, I've worked around these ideas for as long as I can remember, even back into my teens and younger. What I've always felt is there's a missing piece to the society and the setup that we have. And the problem is that the information that rises to the top has a choke point. And the only way to get past the choke point, it doesn't seem like you can do it through political power, and it doesn't seem like you can do it through, sheer force of will or trying to put a community together. You have to do it through a media vehicle, because what happens is this information comes up, let's say, about money missing from HUD. And then they do a few stories on it and it goes away. And you don't understand it as an average citizen, what the impact is. And then you run across somebody like Catherine Austin Fitts, who said, well, when I ran HUD, it was used as a candy store for projects like people like Oliver North would run, for example. So then you get a very different idea of how this works when you peer a little bit deeper into her story. And she says, well, Lockheed Martin controlled all the data systems when I try to get data on different agencies in the government. Well, this is important. Why is this important? Because having those records and understanding where the money goes and what they're using it for, especially when we have secret programs around space and secret developmental programs, underground bases, all this other stuff, and you have tremendous deficits in the public state, and the covert state is overflowing with this missing money, you have kind of a schizophrenic situation between the two. So for me, dark journalism was about bringing forward the real facts in a media outlet and explaining the story and letting the facts stand for themselves, but giving people a context for understanding these things, because I've seen people come out who are great whistleblowers, and I've seen people come out who have great research or whatever, but there can be a quirk around these things. There can be one thing that's not quite right, or there can be an over-exaggeration of something, and we need to be able to accept the information that's good and refine it down so we understand the real picture. The mainstream media definitely will not give it to us. The alternative media has a better shot at doing it because it has a wider range, but it has less resources, which means people often resort to bravado and things like that. So dark journalism has 3 basic rules, and I'll run by them here really quickly. There's the official story, and the official story is, something like, for example, in the housing crisis, they said, well, there were a few bad actors and it almost took the money system down. Then there's the counter story, and the counter story is about, they often call it conspiracy theory, but usually it attracts people like Seymour Hersh or authors and respected people, professors, and smart citizens who get an idea that they're being taken for a ride and that the official story isn't true. So that's the counter story. That's number 2. The third one is the one we have to watch for the closest, and it's the junk conspiracy. I call it the third force. The junk conspiracy, and by the way, every major story that comes out will have it. You know, people talk about these different shootings and things that happen, or they talk about major deep state events that happen in history. All of them have these 3 levels. I've seen the pattern repeat itself over and over again. And the third level is dangerous because junk conspiracy is to take the power and the float out of the second part, the counter story. You know, the people who are really looking into the thing, who are qualified. So, for example, in the JFK assassination, the official story, you know, Oswald shot with an old gun from a building, had incredible luck, and even though Kennedy was shot from the front, somehow Oswald did it from behind. That's the official story. And by the way, Oswald was a commie. Okay. Never mind the fact that he contracted for the CIA, worked for Guy Bannister, was a right-winger in New Orleans the summer before. All right. The counter story is, no, that's not true. There were CIA forces opposed to Kennedy and his policies. And somehow in this kind of deep state milieu, these forces came together and, you know, worked to eliminate Kennedy. That's the counter story, often called the conspiracy theory. And then the junk conspiracy would be something which would make you get off the second conspiracy because it just makes everything seem too crazy. It would be like, you know, Jackie did it or the driver did it. Or so the junk conspiracy is very tricky, or, you know, like, or Kennedy was never shot, or, you know, one of those things that's just so far out. The junk conspiracy is very often insidious, though, because what will happen is it creates a chilling effect on the counter story because people in the public start to associate people in the second category with people in the third category. And they say, you know what, I'm going to go back to the official story because at least I'm safe from crazy people who think the driver did it, for example. So this is what happens. And we have a lot of that in the alternative community, let's be honest. Alternative media, you know, tracks things like flat earth and things of this nature. These are, and we've seen the players, and I've pointed them out at times, and sometimes the players are being used too. So I'm not trying to point any one out in particular, but I do feel that there's a lot of manipulation in the space, let's say. So dark journalism was my response to it, and people would say, well, you know, what is the name dark journalism? What do you mean? To do this, I estimated as a reporter, you'd have to go into really dark places that other people didn't want to go to. And so you'd have to do dark journalism, and a person who would do that would be a dark journalist. It's about as simple as it gets on that. But thank you for asking, and I'll have coffee with you, and we'll talk about it some more.
Okay.
Olivia, you're up.
All right. Okay, so there's just all these questions about the capsule.
Yeah, I want to hear it.
So, all right.
I mean, that is what we're here for.
Okay, Dennis Cole, how do you know they haven't found it?
Well, it's possible. However, Merritt expressed such confidence at the clever way that it was hidden. And from what I've heard him describe, I do feel that it's possible that it's still there. Now, it does seem to me that he has a kind of almost preternatural sense that it's still there. And I find that fascinating. And I do feel that the odds, based on the conversations with him, it seems to me the odds are pretty good.
Okay. David Ward, but where is the capsule? Only Merritt knows where it is, apparently. Is that true? Only Merritt? 3
people know where the capsule is. And so that's Merritt has the actual directions and instructions on how to get to it. And he's placed it with 3 people.
Okay. Possessed RC, do you believe the capsule to be intact at its location? Is there any info from Merritt about how it was done? For example, did Nixon simply dig and bury? He didn't trust anyone.
Well, you're right about that. Here's what's interesting about it. There is this, and the people have sent me these pictures, and I will post them at some point. I'm still trying to verify where and the time frame they all came from. But the Obama administration, before it left, dug up so much of the grounds of the White House, which I found was very interesting that they did this 2 months before Obama left office. And then the Clintons, of course, somebody pointed out, there's a great story about the Clintons taking all this furniture from the White House before they left. And now this is speculation on my part, but I almost wonder if there isn't a legend about this time capsule there in those power circles. And if there aren't people who look for the thing that Nixon placed there in the White House unsuccessfully. You know, so yes, I can't say if it's there. The best way to do it is to take Merritt's instructions and go and see for sure. But again, remember that Henry Kissinger was also given a copy of this, which I find fascinating. The other thing that I don't really stress too much is that, one, Nixon recorded the interview or the meeting where he read the letter, which means there's a tape of it somewhere, and that there were 2 cassette tapes in the message that he taped to Merritt's stomach that went to Henry Kissinger. So I do wonder what those tapes contain.
Jason Doss, do you think Kissinger knows where the time capsule is?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you on that one because Merritt didn't say, but my feeling is that Kissinger has his own version of it. That's for certain. And Kissinger knows about the ET presence from working that closely with Nixon. And they were probably in that last year, in 72, the year before he got elected, and then Watergate hit, although the Watergate situation happened in June of 72. In that time frame, I think they were planning for this, for his 3rd term. And I think they were planning on bringing out the UFO disclosure part on their own terms. And they felt like with the bicentennial of the country, which is another factor that plays into this that I think is very important, because there's a time capsule theme going on around the bicentennial.
I like that. Sandy Scott, who is going to be there to see the capsule be extracted so no more lies are entertained?
There's a list of people. I'm on that list right now. And representatives of the media and of Merritt.
Okay. No name. Has Douglas Caddy heard from the National Archives as yet? And if so, what have they said or done to date regarding the Nixon time capsule?
I heard from Doug yesterday. The only thing that I can say for certain is that they did receive the request, but there is no response officially from them. Now, there are some very interesting there are interesting things around contacts should the National Archives not prove to be up to the task or have no desire to do it for any reason. There are other channels of communication to see this through, but certainly it'd be better if they did it. And that's what's in Caddy's letter. Okay, what else?
Okay. Bill Ferry, if the government does not acknowledge Caddy's request, if they attempt to debunk or eliminate it, will he or you publish what's known of Nixon's time capsule letter?
I would say anything about publishing or anything like that would all be up to Robert Merritt. And I think that Merritt kind of came forward with the information that he had on this, and that the letter itself, you know, for it to be verified and in Nixon's hand and everything, it would be better to actually have the letter in hand than to have someone tell us what was in it. Yes.
Okay, Drew Streitberg, how would you release the capsule? Instantaneous, live?
Well, as I understand it now from Caddy and Caddy's letter, they would try to do it to have the National Archives and someone representing the White House meet us there at the White House, and they would be led to the time capsule, and the only condition is they'd have to read it. So it would be done in a kind of non-sensational fashion, but certainly they would have to agree to release it. Now, there could be some kind of national security concern around the idea of a president's message, and as I understand it, it's the State Department that would handle that aspect of it and evaluate it. I don't see, in any case, once we know that the time capsule is there, that the letter is there, certainly they'll have to release the relevant portions. That's a different kind of conversation that we could get into. But my own feeling is that the odds of us getting the National Archives, it's kind of, there is a little bit of a wait and see what they want to do with it, because there are factors from other agencies that could be, let's say, something of a challenge to handling it, but we don't know at this point. Hopefully it would be just as simple as saying, look, we have a historical document, take it or leave it. And they would say, okay, we'll read it aloud, you know, and we don't have to believe that Nixon knew this, but he did say it, you know. I mean, there are a lot of different scenarios like that. But certainly in its most cut and dry fashion, there's a letter, according to a Huston Plan member who worked at the White House for Nixon, or who met with Nixon in the White House, and Nixon gave him assignments. He claims that there's a time capsule that Nixon left behind. We do have supportive information from things like the Emma Nager documentary that Nixon was moving towards this UFO disclosure, and the fact that Merritt has been found reliable by different agency sources over 4 decades of work.
Okay, artsy dude, get the best remote viewers on the planet to spill the beans.
Well, I'll tell you, I know some of the best. So I hear you. I feel your pain. So I don't think that this is something that is out of the question by any stretch of the imagination.
You know, I haven't watched all the videos myself. I hate to admit it.
Olivia, unbelievable.
So, could you, but I remember somebody asking earlier, could you go over exactly how much Merritt recalls, and like what is in the time capsule? What do we know is in there specifically? And did Merritt tell you everything that he knew, or was he holding back at all?
Well, with a confidential informant, the way I understand it from people who are in law enforcement, you can never be certain. And certainly there were things he told me that he would take to his grave. I don't think it concerns the time capsule or the alien presence. I think it concerns things relating to jobs done for the Nixon administration under these covert circumstances. What I recommend anyone do who's interested in this story is start with the first video, which is my exclusive interview with Merritt, where he reveals these things. I had so many hours of conversation with Merritt, and the conversation that we have that's there is the one that relates the most to his 3 meetings at the White House. That's the main conversation that we're focusing on. He does have a lot of historical information, of course. He shared this incredibly controversial information about the Huston Plan and these kind of midnight courts that would take place, where he would go in and he'd have to sign affidavits so that they could get these warrants out to surveil different law firms and policy institutes and things of that nature, and liberal groups. So that's a whole slice of history that all these Watergate historians and people along this political line are going to get into. And frankly, the UFO crowd, you know, the people who are around the media of the UFO crowd, there's only a few people I think can handle a story like this who understand the politics aspects. And Linda Moulton Howe is one of them, which is why I'm glad that that's taking place tonight, because she's really an ideal person to go to for this. But the basic thrust of the story is that he had these meetings and that Nixon discussed the alien presence, and that Nixon said we had this being in our protection for over 2 decades, and that it literally fell into our laps, and that we've learned so much about it that it could make us the greatest nation, but it also could make the world a greater place. I'm thinking that this relates to the energy, because there's a formula in the letter, and the formula's in red ink, and it's something that Nixon really wanted to point out to Merritt. Obviously, this formula is groundbreaking, and I believe, now Merritt didn't say it was an energy formula, but this is my guess, that it represents this unlimited source of energy. That's what I think is happening in the letter. Now, there are many other points, because Merritt didn't care for and didn't know a lot about UFOs or aliens, for example. So it just so happens that he had a great memory, and he memorized the conversation. He understood what he was supposed to do, and he was instructed not to ask any questions. At a certain point, he did anyway, and he said, you know, are these things related to things like we hear about, where they keep aliens in Nevada and these different things? And Nixon was actually shocked that he even knew about it and that was out. And you know, the thing that Nixon tried to impress on him was it's so important to humanity, that it had the ability to be incredibly devastating to humanity, or it could uplift us, and that we had gotten this thing. And, you know, what's amazing about it is, it seems to me that Nixon was kind of taking ownership of it, because, of course, he was the one who had worked on the CIA Blue Book cases back in the 1950s. And here he was in 72, over a decade later, talking about it. You know, his revelations are remarkable, because it gives us an idea of Nixon's relationship to that UFO file, which we haven't really had up to now. And I think that now we have the supportive evidence of things and movements that the Nixon administration was doing. And if we put the testimony of Merritt together with these different things, that's like the big missing piece. But the time capsule is really the missing piece, because Nixon was an incredible speechwriter. He wrote his own speeches, and being articulate. You know, what's fascinating for me is, and I questioned him about this, upside down, sideways, and all around, but Planet X was the location, was the name that he gave for the alien's location. So this being, he identified as being from Planet X. Now, we know Planet X was around in the 19th century as an idea, and science fiction, 30s and 40s, certainly was kind of a catch-all term. And in 1976, and I've pointed this out, Zecharia Sitchin combined this research around Planet X and came up with Nibiru, which comes out of the mythology and the astronomy of the Sumerians. And I think it's fascinating, really, to put those two things together, because Sitchin came forward with that in 76. So this information may have been floating in these circles. Some of that may have been leaked to him, because Sitchin had incredible connections also. So I think there's so much in Merritt's testimony. And what he said to me is that he profiled me as somebody who would give him his story a kind of a fair shake, you know, and that I'd be honest about it, basically. And what I've tried to do is bring his story forward. And I think that there's so much in his story, and we learn so much from it, but the time capsule is really where the story goes, because if we can get to the time capsule, if we can read it, and by the way, your question was, what's in the time capsule? It's the message to the American people. As I understand it, that is the essence of the time capsule. There were cassette tapes that were given to Henry Kissinger in that package, but there's no mention of cassette tapes in relation to this time capsule message. So it is a very exciting story. I do hope we get our hands on it, and I do think it could change history. I think Merritt's coming forward has already changed history in relation to what we know about the Nixon administration. Olivia.
Okay, Kev T, do we have dates of these meetings?
Yes. Meetings took place between early May and late July. The first two meetings are before Watergate happens on June 17th, 1972. And of course, in that second meeting, we know that Merritt was trying to give Nixon some idea that Watergate was going to happen, because he'd heard it from his friend Rita Reed, who was a switchboard operator across from the Watergate apartments and had heard these military intelligence officials talking about the break-in. And Nixon kind of blew it off and said, yeah, you know, there's a few agencies interested in that, but if they expose stuff that's related to the Democrats, who cares? Not thinking that his own guys were going to get caught in that web. So when he comes to him and meets him in the third meeting, Nixon is already broken up and actually in tears because he knows his presidency is over. And the only joy that he shows is when he reflects on the fact that the alien story, that the ET disclosure will make him secure his place in history. And that's how Merritt brings those meetings forward. And it is interesting that he talks about how Nixon had this fascination for threes and saying things 3 times and doing things in threes. And there are those 3 meetings with Merritt, and his absolute confidence. It's in the video from today that I put out, which I really recommend everyone watch. But when he says to Merritt, it's going to come out, it's going to be discovered. And Merritt say, when should I do that? You know, like, am I going to do it? Am I supposed to, what's supposed to happen here? And Nixon says, you know, you might do it, you know, if the time is right. And Merritt's like, what if something happens to me? And he says, don't worry, Henry's still living. So it's a very interesting, almost preternatural sense that Nixon has that it's going to be discovered. Absolute confidence that Nixon has that it's going to be discovered when he's talking to Merritt. I mean, this is the essence of the story, and I feel that Merritt, being in the health that he's in, is trying to give us something. And the question is, are we awake enough as a group of people trying to solve this mystery to take advantage of it? So I'm making those efforts. Douglas Caddy is making those efforts. Linda Moulton Howe is making those efforts. So we're going to have to see. But certainly I hope people do step up to the plate for this one.
Okay, Ethereal Ocean.
Ethereal Ocean, there's a great name.
Are any guardians or safety checks in place to ensure the capsule doesn't fall into the wrong hands?
I mean, from the point of view of it's there now in the White House, so, you know, obviously we don't have any access to it, so there's no safeguards there. But if you're talking about is Merritt's information being safeguarded, the information that he has relating to the directions, he's kept somewhere. So in that sense, I would say the answer is yes.
Dennis Cole asks an interesting question. Why is he going to YouTube and not having huge press conference on CNN, Fox, and major news?
Well, I mean, CNN, Fox, and major news may come around to this story because we broke the story here. But, you know, although the New York Times has spoken and done articles on Merritt relating to his Watergate experience, they're not capable. I mean, do they even know anything about the UFO part? No. And do they have any desire to cover it? Well, you know, the TTSA, maybe with Harry Reid and Bigelow, pulled a few strings to get the New York Times to play ball with them. And Leslie Kean was on board for that. But this kind of a story, I think he would be wasting his time trying to go to a news outlet like that because they wouldn't want to take the context seriously. So I think Merritt, remember, is good at profiling people. And we have to remember that just the depth of the work that he had to do, where you had to profile people almost in a survival situation about who you could work with and all the rest of it, who you could share information with. This is the background that he comes out of. We're talking about it like somebody buying a house or something. I mean, this is the level that we're on. You know, he is somebody who has developed this sense for where to put, where to share his information. And he knows how to share secrets, and he knows the value of secrecy. So I think probably through my interview, he got a sense that he could trust me. And certainly he's worked with Douglas Caddy getting his story out, that hasn't always been rosy between the two of them. I don't want to give the impression that they have always been on the same page. As a matter of fact, at one point in the 70s, Caddy was one of Merritt's targets. So they certainly are strange bedfellows, but I think they joined forces to bring some of these secrets out about history and pertaining to Watergate, and that this is really something different. This is really kind of the special depth of Merritt's knowledge, and it concerns the time capsule and his 3 meetings with Nixon.
Great question coming up. Rafael Lopez, did you hesitate talking about the time capsule? Now we do know, but so did they. I
thought about this, and if I had had my druthers in the very beginning of this, I wanted to say, and I think even my first episode was going to say, a government building. But they, both Caddy and Merritt felt pretty confident saying the White House because it is a vast environment. And obviously with the way it was hidden and what Merritt knows about that, he felt confident saying the White House. And they've both been in it, by the way. And of course, Caddy has done work for the White House, and he was part of that environment around the Watergate thing, because Howard Hunt was not only his close friend, but it was one of his clients. And of course, that's how he got to represent the burglars. So that whole Washington milieu, I would say they're both very familiar with. But yeah, that was my first thought too. So I'm right there with you. It's like, oh, he told them it was in the White House. But I do feel like instead of just going through a huge scan for this thing, it's very easy to get the directions from Merritt. He's not asking for money or any special attention. He's just saying you have to read the message publicly, which I think is reasonable.
Okay. Little edgy question here.
Yes.
Golden Apple, please clear up the controversy around Coast to Coast being a CIA psyop. And if it is a psyop, why would you go on there?
Well, Coast to Coast is it's a radio station. It's a radio program that goes on all these different stations and has a great reach. And they have a amazing history of dealing with the UFO issue, all the way back to Art Bell, which everyone can remember. And of course, Art Bell's show was based on the Long John Nebel show, which goes back before it. So there's a real tradition there. Now, there might be things that go on inside a company that we could look at one way or another, and they're doing something for profit or leaving things out or getting rid of certain people. And that's kind of, I guess it's subjective is the word that I would use. My thing about it is very simple, which is the Coast to Coast, I always held in a certain type of regard because great people have passed through it. Some of the amazing people that have passed through my show, Stanton Friedman, Graham Hancock. There's, it's a show, it's a format, it's an environment. They do it every night. So Linda Moulton Howe, in particular, I think does the best shows on Coast. And I've known Linda for many years, and we're good friends. And I feel that she was really the perfect person to handle this story. And you can see tonight she's going to do a fantastic job. But thank you. It's a good question.
Okay.
You have to ask these
David
things.
Ward has the best question. Okay. If the time capsule is revealed publicly, how do you think this is going to shape the geopolitical situation between, say, the US and Russia and China, given their involvement with UFOs as well?
Well, gee, after this Putin thing, I really, it's fascinating. I think we have a real diplomatic problem, and we better address it, and we better use, one of the strange things about this is that Nixon had a fantastic relationship with Russia, and he understood that that's what we need. And we don't need to be competitors in this day and age. And we don't need to be waving nuclear weapons at each other. It's the absurd thing. What is this, Nikita Khrushchev in 1958? So I would say that Putin took a tremendous stand in the wrong direction there. And I think we've taken equally bad moves in relation to Russia. And, you know, what they promised, the Clinton administration promised the deep state Cold War 2.0, and they were going to, you know, encircle Russia and all this stuff. So Russia's taken a lot of heat. And look at the American media being completely irresponsible with the Russia collusion BS and, you know, Mueller and all this nonsense, wasting the public's money on this. So, you know, getting scraps, grabbing these guys who were supposedly using $2 million to influence Facebook. I mean, so we have a lot of issues around there. Geopolitically, any country that comes forward with information pertaining to the UFO file, it's going to cause an earthquake. There's no question about it. But I do feel that even that resistant group that's hugging secrecy around this has always built that wall of secrecy. I feel like members in there are also coming to the conclusion that they have to in some way bring this out, but they want to do it on their own self-serving terms, and that's the nature of the problem.
Okay, so no name again. Will the C2C segment from tonight be available on YouTube, Earth Files, or on the Dark Journalist website?
There's going to be a on Earth Files, there's going to be a special report, and it will include audio files. It'll be slightly different because coast is coast. It's, you know, they do their own thing, but Linda's doing an incredible Earth Files report that will be available to the public starting tomorrow. But I still suggest you tune in tonight because it's going to be a lively one. Okay. If you're awake, go ahead.
Can we throw in some questions on other topics?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
You're the boss.
What, John Batts, what do you think about what Alex Jones said on the Joe Rogan podcast?
Are you talking about what he said about the breakaway civilization? You know, if that's what it is, then I think it was kind of bizarre. I mean, he did mention aliens there. I think that whole Alex Jones thing, it would be good for somebody to say to Alex, to get back to your roots, what you do, to kind of, you know, I think being too much like the emergency broadcast man is not such a great thing. And I definitely prefer that kind of 2010, 2011 Hellraiser Alex versus the ultra political one. But I guess it is interesting, the clashes of worlds. So somebody like Rogan with Jones, those types of events I think are good. And I think that Rogan, they try to do something, you know, to have him like smoke pot with them or something. And, you know, instead he vaped, or I don't know. But there are these shows that do that, right? Where you're supposed to like smoke pot and stuff. I can't even imagine for the life of me doing that. The work that I feel is going on around this stuff is so serious that you need every brain cell firing. You know, you can't have a drink and talk about this stuff. It doesn't work that way for me. Although I like a good glass of wine when work is over. Okay, so I hope that's a good answer.
That's good. Mr. Haha, your thoughts on Project Serpo?
Well, you know, Serpo was one of those things, and the Camelot people were very involved with it. The Camelot thing, it's interesting. They got people in situations, and things would come up, and some people would come forward, and some of those people would get in trouble for coming forward. And I think some of the great hits that they had, like Bob Dean, for example, who gave us an idea of how that the world of NATO looked at the UFO issue in the 60s, were a result of the fact that they had a lot of misses on the other hand. So you do a number of these things, and you have some hits and misses. And when you have a really good hit, then you can kind of say, okay, with the misses, it's all right, because I had, you know, somebody like Dean come forward, or some of their other people. So that's the way I would look at that. In terms of, are we doing exchanges, and do we have people living in environments in space and with aliens, and is there some kind of exchange program? It's too hard. I mean, it's a tricky thing to look at. I do feel that, you know, there are cases in UFO literature that are factual. One of the incredible cases took place in Australia when a UFO just basically swallowed up a plane of this 22-year-old Frederick Valentic, who really was interested in UFOs, which is what I find so fascinating. So there is something with those people that have disappeared. I always go back to the famous scene of Close Encounters where these guys come out who are World War II pilots, and they're like, where have I been for 30 years? There's a reason that's in the literature. And obviously, we have had the ability, if we go back to the time capsule idea and what Nixon told Merritt, we've had the ability, and lots of other whistleblowers, but we've observed and had under our protection or in our custody these beings, and so they've had some of ours. So that much is certain. The alternative 3 aspect of that and the Serpo aspect of that, I think that there are programs, but I don't know how far along they are or if they ever got off the drawing board. So that's a tricky one.
Okay, I'm going to throw Scruples 4444 a bone. Okay, that's been asking for a while.
4444.
Okay, a big group of people associate owl sightings with ET contact.
Wow.
Can you comment on that?
Listen, owls have been all over the joint lately. People have been talking to me about owls. There's, of course, a book called Owls the Messengers, I think, which is, can't think of the author's name, but, and then I was talking to someone just recently about the movie that came out where they had these owls that would, actually be aliens and just using that as a screen memory and stuff. Owls are fascinating. Just go into the Twin Peaks mythology, and there's no question that there's a lot of mysticism surrounding owls. I feel like whenever you get on that mystical track, that there is this whole kind of symbiosis between mystical thinking, esoteric thinking, and knowledge of other beings. So it's a consciousness kind of a thing. But certainly there's some connection. A lot of those screen memories, though, they can use other things besides owls. But I do think it's interesting. It's a great question. Great symbolism. Olivia.
Okay. How much credit do you give to the Twining memo?
Yeah, it's absolutely verifiable. And at that point, late 40s, early 50s, they had a much different, they even had a better public pose about this. There are Harry Truman press conferences where he talks about UFOs, and he's like, well, they're out there, but they don't pose any national security threats. So just, don't worry about it. That's a better line to take. I think it's kind of like, it's a tell the people thing. Like, we're all in this together. Yes, we're seeing them around. As opposed to the, no, you're crazy. And by the way, there were no crashes at Roswell and all the rest of it. But the Twining memo gets to the point of the program of how we learn to develop an approach to this phenomena that was mastering our skies and that we had to get a handle on. And so they came in with certain types of advice about military things, certain types of advice about, how to deal with it. And so therefore, all of that information, I think, is completely verified. Yeah, there's a large-scale program after World War II to deal with UFOs. No question about it. As a matter of fact, I feel ridiculous that history doesn't include the UFO aspect. It feels like, you won't talk about this elephant in the room. It's almost like a societal issue, just like, pre-civil rights or something. We didn't have this kind of integration in movies and things like that. It's just this ridiculous thing that, it's a factor and it's there, and the culture can move forward by dealing with it. And the political mess, the people holding the secrecy and the people holding on to the kind of, this wall of denial around it, they're obviously benefiting from having the information, while the regular public citizen, Fitz often goes to her term about Winston Churchill, and I'm with her, which is Churchill's line is tell the people. And that's what I think, that's where we need to move toward. It would be a good idea at this point. We've had enough 75 years of a show around this. Let's get on with it. The time capsule will do it, by the way. You're
okay. You're going to love this one. Ivasovic J, again. What's DJ's opinion of the Bush Sr. photo in Dallas on the same day as the JFK assassination, and what's his involvement with the UFO file?
Oh, my God. Bush is such a deep player with the UFO file. And Bush is a deep player with the Nixon administration. Now, let's think about this. Prescott Bush, who was a known Nazi collaborator, because he set up a bank in the 40s, and the FDR raided it. And the reason they raided it was because the bank was basically just doing business with Nazi Germany like no war had happened, and it's laundering money and stuff. And Dulles was involved in that too. So they couldn't prosecute him because he was the head of the OCO, the USO, I'm sorry. And so they thought it would kind of put a dampening thing on it. And Bush had incredible connections. I could sit here. There's an incredible book by Russ Baker called Family of Secrets about the Bushes in relation to the JFK assassination and their entire political background. I recommend that book. I think it's quite an achievement, and it still stands. The Bushes are quite a hardcore deep state group of people. And I think there are different wings even in that Bush family. But fascinatingly enough, Prescott Bush, because he was Nixon's mentor and really got him into the whole thing, he said, look, I need you to work with Poppy, which was George H.W. Bush, and like get him in there. And, you know, Bush got to be the United Nations ambassador under Nixon. He got to be head of the RNC under Nixon. And then under Ford, he became the CIA director, was CIA director under Carter. The classic conversation, Carter says, by the way, in this the first few months in office, I want all the UFO files. I need to look at this and that. And Bush said, no, you don't have a need to know on that. And Carter fires him. Bush is an unbelievably deep player. I'm going to do a show on Bush and in relation to this. So I appreciate the question.
I would love to know the answer to this one. So Primal State, who's new to this channel,
oh,
welcome.
Boy. Welcome.
Okay, best summary video of the alien situation.
Well, I feel like the UFO economy, which is my interview with Catherine Austin Fitts, gives you the entire perspective of the UFO in our society and how it actually affects us. That's why it's called the UFO economy. And somehow Fitts coming in from this angle of business and finances and Wall Street and knowing that world and then studying from this other angle, to me, is the most enlightening. In terms of research, I think that John Mack's research is some of the best. And he gets into the consciousness aspect of the contactees dealing with it. Stanton Friedman's work around the government suppression of the issue, the cases he's brought forward, certainly some of the best. Some of the older documentaries by Wendell Stevens, absolutely fascinating. And you can get a lot from them because they're very close to the issue. They're not high finance documentaries. They seem clunky by comparison now, but they are fascinating. So I would look at it like that. I would start there. And I also like the Richard Dolan second volume of UFOs in the National Security State. He never did a third one. It's too bad. But the second one is good. It's better than the first one.
I would also put James Fox in there.
Oh, yeah. If you want just documentaries, certainly James Fox, Out of the Blue.
I Know What I Saw.
I Know What I Saw. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are terrific. Anything that deals with the Phoenix Lights case also. By the way, there's a video out there, which is me, Catherine Austin Fitts. Let me think of this now. To my right was Linda Moulton Howe, and on my left was Joseph Farrell. And it's the Secret Space Program Conference 2015, and it's the roundtable discussion. That really gives you the picture of where we are in relation to the UFO issue, the financial issue around that, the cultural cover-up going on with it, where it's headed, what it's for. That's over a 2-hour conversation that took place in Austin, Texas in 2015 in November. And wow, there's so many great details there. That's where I would go. You're up.
Giovanni Delgado, how do you suppose so many different agencies knew about Watergate? Great question.
That is a really good question. The thing is that there were different groups vying for control and vying for the kind of feather in their cap of removing Nixon from office. You know, this was an achievement. It seems to me that if one of the things that Merritt puts on the record is that Bob Woodward was in military intelligence, which we know he came out of military intelligence before he was a journalist, but that he studied with Schaeffler these techniques of surveillance and went through this program, and that Schaeffler's the one who grabbed the burglars. A military intelligence man who was a police officer, was his night off. So he was off duty. He was just hanging around, and he knew they were going to be there. But then you think about Hunt, and Hunt controlling the burglars with Liddy, and how Hunt and Liddy went back, and they're associated with the activities in the 50s. Hunt's associated as the paymaster of the JFK assassination. These are deep state players vying for control against each other. And I think that there was a vulnerability that people knew with Nixon trying things like the Huston plan, which, by the way, he discussed openly with members of the FBI and the leaders of these intelligence agencies. He set up a situation there where they could pretend to go along with him and then use that plumbers unit against him, which in fact they did. Remember, most of Nixon's presidency, again, is about trying to get control back from the intelligence agencies. Kennedy's presidency, trying to get control of the UFO file back. Nixon, Eisenhower, when he's leaving, talks about that military-industrial complex. This is a World War II general warning you about the military. It's incredible. So this is the battle and the struggle as it exists. When Trump goes into office, they try anything, Russian dossiers, anything to get him out of office. The CIA is putting their people out there up front trying to get him out of office. They try to make sure that he didn't get in. So this branch, they're happy to run the United States, but they're not duly elected. They are representatives of this deep state, and we deserve a public state representing, it's a representative government in America. That's what it's all about.
Okay. C.B. Bernard, how might geoengineering interface with the alien presence on Earth? Do you see a connection?
Could they be using geoengineering in order to prepare or to monitor the alien presence? It's interesting. I often think that they employ different techniques in order to study. One of the things, I had a conversation with Joseph Farrell, and we were talking about scanners at airports and how they didn't need to use the variety that they were using. There were different ones that they could use. Why would they use these kind of, you know, the ones that spew radioactivity every time you go through the screener? And one of the things is, he said that it was possible that they were looking for a certain physical type that was different from the regular physical type, i.e. they were looking for either alien hybrids or an ET presence masquerading in a human body. And that's where a lot of that push came from. So there are these things that take place behind the scenes. I haven't seen exact evidence that geoengineering is related to observation of the ET phenomena, but I will say that a lot of the people in that world, like Elena Freeland, for example, think that UFOs come from plasma and that they're taking on plasma bodies in order to do things here on Earth. That's pretty fascinating. Okay, you're up.
Okay, Rich.
And we'll take about 4 or 5 more questions.
Okay.
Because we've got Coast tonight. Remember,
what does Dan think Bigfoot is?
The truth is, I'm having a better time here with you guys, though.
So true.
I'll tell you something which is fascinating. I had all these conversations with someone named Rick Thurston, who was a channel, actually, but he was the person, it turned out, who had predicted the October 13th, 2010 sightings over New York. And he was a fascinating guy, lived in Canada. And during the day, he helped mentally handicapped children. And during the night, he would do his psychic work. So he had this kind of understanding of service in relation to psychic phenomena. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, because the whole thing has to be about service in order for people to grow. And a lot of people just want to, you know, be short-sighted about it and say, well, you know, can I develop telepathy or something? So the idea is, what are you going to use it for? But anyway, Thurston was a remarkable person. And one of the things, when I went into his history, he passed away about a year after our initial talks. And I recorded something like 10 hours of conversations with him. But one of the things that he said, which I found interesting, was that Bigfoot was part of an Atlantean experiment in genetics that was kind of a leftover. And that the Atlanteans, as we know from the Casey readings, were very advanced, and that they had their own version of this kind of DNA manipulation. And that basically, you know, we have these legends about Sasquatch and things like that from these Native American cultures. There's something very special about the mythos of the Sasquatch. So my guess would be something along the line of what Thurston said, which is, we're looking at something that was created by the Atlanteans and is in very small number. But, you know, only the Native Americans really know, because they're the ones who lived side by side with those groups, with those beings.
Okay. Gem with Jumbo. Is there a Masonic tie with ET relations?
Yes, most definitely. Well, when you go into the Masons, you understand that they take a look at the big picture. And a lot of those esoteric groups understood the alien thing long before we're talking about it here in this public way. There are groups who understood and talked about these things. And the Masons in particular, you know, in the government, when there's this famous case of in 1941, and it involved Truman as vice president, FDR as president, and they took the remains of this crashed saucer, and they did a Masonic ritual, actually, sometime after Pearl Harbor, when this took place. So that's a fascinating case, and I feel like it gives us an idea of the secrecy aspect around the Masons understanding what this is all about. So certainly they play a major role. And the information that they have now, it's not available to regular Masons. That's a dedicated inner circle. And they migrate into different groups. I mean, the Masons have youth groups too, let's not forget, where they train people in their teens to, you know, kind of develop character and things like that. So they have all these different angles and different levels and things. So you couldn't think that an average Mason would have that information. But the deeper inner circles certainly know a lot about it, and other things too. Okay. You're up.
Christine Seibel, are the orbs objects or biological?
It's really fascinating. Orbs are definitely some kind of energy projection, and I don't feel that those are all alien. I think that there is a kind of interdimensional aspect to things like that. I think when people have seen in the past fairies and things of this nature, they're often accompanied by these orbs. There is a kind of a nature intelligence thing, and I think you have to be in a better state of consciousness than we are, you know, with our iPhone and stuff. You have to be kind of in nature and able to accept those impressions. I think very often about Casey and how many of his visions came to him on a Kentucky farm. You know, it seems there's something about the environment that's conducive to giving you those types of impressions, because that's when our mind is open. That's when we can really accept things. And we have to remember that we're receivers and transmitters, which is, you know, it's important to be a good receiver, you know, also. And very often we get hung up on transmitting. We have to be able to listen to the impressions that we get. And I think a lot of psychic research gets into that. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions.
Okay, Drew Streichberg,
All right.
who is on fire tonight. Can Daniel put together a piece on Emery Smith as a whistleblower and how he used to work with Stephen Greer, but now appears on Gaia? I'd love to see some journalism behind his claims.
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about doing autopsies on 3,000 different alien types, and, you know, the Gaia thing, look, the Gaia thing gets into sensationalism, and it's disappointing because just like somebody up there says, David Wilcock, Edgar Casey in past life. No, how's that for an answer? No, as a matter of fact, I'm going to get into this. There's a guy named Winfrey, and he came up with a gimmick. He said, I can get this book done. I just need somebody who looks like Edgar Casey. And somebody referred him to Wilcock. And Wilcock went along with it and created this whole persona because Wilcock wanted to get on the radar. Quite ridiculous. Has nothing to do with Casey at all. Now, Winfrey, it's a great name, right? What does he do after that? Takes his friend and he makes her St. Catherine. And he shows the statue of St. Catherine and he shows the pictures and he does the same gimmick again. So, you know, whatever Winfrey was up to, Wilcock was just one of the props for him to do that. And if I were Wilcock, man, I would, you know, he can do his own research. He has his own stuff that he does, you know, just knock it off with that. I mean, trying to kind of pirate some great person like Edgar Casey and pretend to be him is despicable. I don't know what else to call it. So, you know, Casey gave his life doing readings and helping people. And he was another one who was dedicated to service and doing psychic work. And he died largely impoverished. So before we start hitching our star to these great people giving real service, that's a good time to take a look in the mirror. And truthfully, it kind of doesn't matter who we were. It's what are you doing now anyway? What do you got? What can you do? Who can you help? And that's what's more important. But anyway, that Emery Smith thing, I will say this about Gaia, which is Gaia also has an incredible opportunity where people would look to it and say like, oh, if I'm interested in spiritual things, there's a TV network that deals with it. Well, when they trot out things that aren't very viable because they want to get subscriptions, which is one of the things that they say in their annual write-ups to their shareholders because they're a publicly traded company. Again, we run into problems because they were boasting to their shareholders about the Nazca mummy thing, which turned out to be a complete fraud. So on one hand, you're saying to your shareholders, hey, we did great with that Nazca mummy thing. And on the other hand, the evidence comes down that the stuff that you were looking at wasn't true. So there's that problem there. A company like Gaia could put on good material. There is a track record there of them being associated with this for so many years. People would trust them with it. But if they keep trotting out, you know, galactic ambassadors and Emery Smith and stuff, it's not a very appealing picture. It's not my cup of tea, that's for sure. What else you got?
Okay. Ryan Morphy Richards. What did the Nazis find when the memo came back, Eureka?
Well, I think that what I've come to believe about that is that they found the Templars' treasure. And I think there are mystical ramifications of that. And there's a video that I did. It's actually called Akhenaten Prophecy with Joseph Farrell, where we address that. And I'd tell you to check it out because I think it's one of Farrell's best, actually. Hopefully one of mine too. Anything with Joseph Farrell is great.
All right. So since Farrell came up here,
yes.
So this isn't so much a question, but it was a little thread of discussion going back and forth. There are some great science geeks tonight. And we need to follow up on some research here. But Drew Streichberg again says, I'd love to know whether red mercury was just a myth Given Mercury is discovered underneath various pyramids, what is it about Mercury? And then John Guilfoyle says Mercury is one of the 3 alchemical elements, mercury, salt, and sulfur. I read alchemical, and you know who I thought of immediately.
Joseph Farrell does talk in detail about red mercury and what it represents. And I forget which episode in which we brought that up, but it is fascinating. And whenever you get into alchemy, you're getting into that holding these groups, these brotherhoods, holding information, holding knowledge over time. And we learn incredible things that way. These are things that are handed down. And the whole thing about turning lead into gold and becoming a finer person has to do with sort of transmuting your person, your being, and becoming a higher individual, you know, raising your vibration. I mean, these things rolled off into the public as like theosophy and things like that later, but there's a long history of alchemy. And I think that it's these mystery schools feeding out this information over time, trying to help the society move along, because it took small, concentrated groups to make this happen. One of the fascinating things, I think, and it's in the Gurdjieff teaching, is he says that there's 2 things. Russian philosopher, Armenian, actually, Greek Armenian, but did most of his work in Russia. He said there's 2 things. One is what to do, and then how to do it. So the what to do would be like in Christian mythology, for example, is turn your cheek. And then, but you have so many impulses, how do you do it? So the what to do is public and gets distributed and moved around in a kind of mechanical fashion. People start to know the phrases, but the how to do has to go underground because it's often persecuted or abused, the information. So what to do and how to do it. The what to do is out there in these Christian teachings and Buddhist teachings, so on. The how to do it, well, that's a different road entirely. So when we're dealing with alchemists and alchemy, we're coming into that mystery school fashion, that mystery school element, and it's very intangible. I mean, you think the government wall of secrecy around the UFOs is tough. Try getting into what real mystery schools are. That is very difficult. What else you got?
Everyone always wants to know, and I think you're probably going to have to answer it almost every live show, is Colonel Angus, have you ever had a personal UFO experience?
Well, that's pretty interesting. I would say, in a sense, many, but nothing that would come up to the level of these cases that we hear about. I come up, you know, to the idea of having met people who've been abducted and things like that. That gives me a real, it's an empathic or something. I kind of get a sense of their experience with it. I don't think I've ever been abducted or anything like that. And I don't think there's any like sighting I could point to that was transformative. I think that there's enough that has happened that I've seen where I get a sense that for what they're up to. But no, I don't think I've ever had anything along the lines that would make a particularly compelling story on the UFO front. My stories are more like strolling up the street and meeting Charlie Fultz, or, you know, bumping into John Mack by accident, things like that. You know, it's a theme that keeps popping up over time. And certainly it's been true, though, since I was in my, you know, like 6, 7, 8 years old. Like that line of information, that line of inquiry has always been there.
Because? Yes.
I've always been interested in it.
Your parents were always interested.
Oh, well, it's true. There's an interesting thing there, actually. I always say that's a whole other story, but one of the things I always say about my dad is he wanted to, the only thing that he was interested in was basically creating like a breakthrough energy Tesla type motor. And from what I understand, the FBI called him an anarchist because of that. So it's a whole interesting tale on its own. Okay, what else you got?
JJK, do you feel the alien presence is good or evil?
Well, you know, it's interesting. It's interesting that Charlie Fultz has come up so many times tonight for me. Fultz told me, I asked him the same question, and he had been one of the people who was abducted in the Allagash incident. And he said to me, you know, some people think that they're saviors and some people think that they are evil. But my impression was of someone doing a scientific duty. And I think that the cultures around the UFO alien aspect, what we've seen really predominantly above anything else is that they're doing work the same way we'd be doing work, examining things, doing research. And I do feel that they tend to operate on kind of a higher level, that if you're at a higher level of awareness or consciousness, it's easier to deal with them and interact with them. But I don't rule out the fact that there could be off-world groups that don't have our best interest at heart. But I wouldn't be inclined to go there first. And certainly, I think they've shown the ability, when, you know, from what we've seen in them visiting, that for the most part, we don't see any hostile action on their part. And I think that's something that we're kind of a little too triggered to and looking for. But no, we've seen, if anything, we've seen the opposite from these groups.
Okay, I think this is a good one to end on. Hunter of Truth, what have you discovered with your research that has been most challenging for you personally to accept as truth?
Well, that such a small group of people are manipulating 7 billion other people. That took, you know, it took a while to really process, but it's absolutely something that needs to be understood, which is a very small group that's doing the bidding for Mr. Global, as it were, and kind of monopolizing a number of different things with the public. And so I think that we have to try as a society to move things back local and not have monopolies. You know, like I don't like seeing Amazon take over Whole Foods, for example. I don't like any kind of straight monopoly. I feel like we're looking at situations, we have to compel American society and societies around the globe to go back to local things and to work, you know, not just to have these corporations that think of people in zones and build suicide nets for workers and in China and places like that, but instead have a good competitive capitalist situation with these companies, but have a strong, robust local economy. And I think that's, you know, local food. There's so many options. That's how we can kind of swing things back and get it away from just a small group manipulating everybody else, which isn't working, which destroys wealth, and I think makes things in the situation backward. And that's where you get the black budget going into communities and places like Maine, which has an incredible off-the-charts heroin addiction problem now, where they never had it before, because somebody in that black budget needs to make another, you know, profit eighth. You know, we're looking at situations where we need more control, and we get that from local government and creating our own local communities.
Well, and actually, we can come full circle here, and with the whole YouTube situation, is that what we need to do is create an alternative.
In the grand scheme of things, yeah, there's going to need to be, when you're dealing with the alternative media side of things, independent media is going to need its own platform, and it can't rely on the larger corporate platforms who are going to be in competition with it over market share for real news stories. But the most important thing is to be honest in your reporting and to deliver something of value that people can use. Fantastic. Wow. Great questions. So many great people out tonight too. I'm very excited to have everyone here. I do want to say that we have a great crowd, and I'm going to move this party over to Coast with Linda Moulton Howe in a couple of hours. And we're going to get deep into the time capsule story. But it's great to spend time with you here because you guys are asking great questions. And I love the opportunity of us doing it on top of the fact that I'm going to be with Linda Moulton Howe tonight on Coast. Tomorrow night, we're going to do another live broadcast here. And it's going to be Grant Cameron talking about the Emmenegger documentary and all the things around that. And so we're going to be able to bring all that in. That's tomorrow night. at 7:30. You're good for 7:30?
I'm good.
Okay. So we'll take one more question and then we're out. Thank you.
I'm looking for something good. All right, one to go out on.
Well, I feel like somebody asked me about Patreon, and I'm not on Patreon because what I learned a while ago was just that, having a subscription was the best way to go. I can deliver the shows and give you guys bonus content directly from my site and stuff, no intermediary and stuff. But I will have a Patreon account set up just for people who don't want to deal with PayPal. And so there will be information in our newsletter. The thing to do, talking about YouTube and all the throwdown with all the channels. And by the way, I do support all those channels that are, not all of them. But I mean, when somebody gets thrown off a channel or whatever, if you're doing your work and you're doing your thing, then I don't think that some corporation should just decide to shut off your chip and get rid of you. I think certainly they make the case that, that whole thing about chipping people and then turning off their chip was true. And they make themselves look bad in that exercise. So for people who are trying to get back on YouTube, so much the better. Somebody said, was Bowie an alien over there? I mean, of course he was. Come on. You don't get music like that from a human being, do you? Go ahead.
I just wanted to invite everybody, especially the science geeks who were talking over my head, to reach out on darkjournalist.com.
Yeah, you can go info@darkjournalist.com if you want to get... Oh, there's another one. Did David Bowie fake his death? Oh, no, unfortunately. I wish he had. But I will tell you a couple of interesting things about Bowie. He did feel that he had some alien interaction as a youth. And he actually ran a UFO newsletter in the 60s when he was a hippie, when he was kind of like a, I want to say Leif Garrett hippie, but it's before Leif Garrett, isn't it? So it is kind of fascinating. And in the 90s, I think he tried to regress some of those memories. I don't know whatever happened, but he was a fascinating guy. I was lucky to meet him. I met him twice. And he was a very fast talker and was exceptional. I did an interview when I was working with a lifestyle magazine with Ken Scott. And it was just before I started doing dark journalist stuff. And Ken Scott was the producer of Hunky Dory, Aladdin Sane, Ziggy Stardust, and Pinups. And that whole interview, when Bowie died, I put up the recording of that interview, and it's on this channel if you want to listen to it. It's incredible information about Bowie and recording in that period. So absolutely fascinating stuff. Well, you guys have been great. I really appreciate it. And, Coast to Coast tonight with Linda, with Robert Merritt's amazing story. Really excited about that. And I do feel that we're on the cusp of something here. But there is this need to complete the picture. So we've laid out the Holloman aspect. We've brought forward Merritt's testimony. We've talked to Caddy about the background. We've talked to Caddy about the National Archives letter. And now we're going to go and sort of explore the Emenegger documentary tomorrow, also a little bit deeper. But tonight we'll be with you, and join us tomorrow night also, right here at 7:30. And Olivia, wow, incredible. Thank you. I couldn't do it without you.
Anybody who did not have their questions answered, feel free to tune in tomorrow. Ask them again.
Yes.
I'll try to get you in.
She'll be, oh my God, she'll be on top of it. And thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to have you here. And I'm glad, such a great crowd. Christine Taggart, it's nice to have you back too. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all guys tomorrow night and later on tonight at Coast. So thanks so much and have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Olivia, of course. The greatest.